Good evening, everybody. It's Christina speaking. It's Sunday evening at 8:30, October the 1st. I hope everybody's having a lovely weekend and a good month to everyone. The reason that you're hearing me this evening is because recently there was, Steph did a podcast on humiliation wherein he became very passionate in what he was saying. And there's been quite a bit of debate on the board about whether or not his reaction was abusive or whether he was just being passionate and expressing an opinion. And we've been discussing this issue, and I thought it might be worthwhile to offer my comments. I was going to write something and post it on the board, but this might be a better, more succinct forum, and Steph might be able to offer some insights as well as to what was happening for him while that debate was going on. There was one particular listener who took exception to Steph's podcast and felt that it was abusive, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Steph responded by saying that perhaps this gentleman's reaction to Steph had more to do with his own past and history than with what actually was going on for Steph at the time, and that Steph may not necessarily have been abusive in talking about his feelings. And so this gentleman wrote a post on the board, and I just want to read it to you, and then we'll go from there, because I think there's some very interesting things to be said about anger. So Steph asked him about his childhood, because he thought that this gentleman's childhood was perhaps influencing the feelings he was having about the podcast. So, okay, Mr. Steph and all you others who want to know about my childhood, and there's a smiley face. I've been giving this a lot of consideration, especially since a friend of mine commented and told me that I was being a complete ass. Well, he didn't say that at all, but after his comment, I realized that I was being an ass. I'll start off by saying that I did not suffer much abuse as a child. What abuse I may have suffered was verbal in nature and simply in the way I was treated in certain regards. I grew up in an alcoholic home, but one which was calm and happy for the most part, not one filled with turmoil and yelling, etc. It took me a long time to understand that while on the surface my upbringing looked pretty normal and healthy, it did suffer as a result of the alcohol. I've spent a fair amount of time in some adult children of alcoholics 12-step program meetings, and these were very helpful. As a devout atheist, I have a really hard time with the religious undercurrents in the 12-step programs. Nonetheless, I must say that they are exceedingly effective. They are exceedingly effective means of understanding and learning to deal with one's issues, and the cost cannot be beat. I do believe that they are free. Anyway, so what I came to understand is that because of alcohol, I could not count on consistency from my parents. They would say one thing and then forget that they'd said it, or they would remember things differently and be adamant in this false recollection. My mother specifically had a way about her that is the core issue for this current discussion. Whether alcohol is at the heart of this or not, I cannot say, but the issue is that she is not open to examining her ideas. When I approach her with an idea that goes against her belief, she will strongly point out that I am wrong, and that is the end of the discussion. I wouldn't say that it is yelling, but it is a firm and elevated tone of voice, and it carries a conviction that the issue is closed. I could be standing at the door with the rain coming through it and making a wet stain on the carpet, and if she said the door was closed, then that was it, and the wet carpet and blowing leaves around my feet would not enter into the argument. I learned from this that there is no point in even bothering to discuss anything with her. It is a waste of time. Not only that, but it is frustrating in that, and this is one of the things that I've learned from those who deal with alcoholism. As a child, this can really destroy one's ability to have faith in one's own sensory perception and ability to reason. I would agree with that. I think that's completely true. And I know you're asking this. I've not spoken with her nor seen my mother in over 12 years and have no intention of doing so in the future. All of this used to cause a great deal of rage in me. When I had clear factual evidence at my disposal, and it mattered not at all, my sense of justice and sanity and faith in my ability to make sense of the world and to even be able to function in a world in which truth and thoughtful reasoning were less than worthless, these things would inflame me. I found that I would end up taking out this rage on others, loved ones in fact, who were in no way responsible for the issues at the heart of my rage. But I was enraged that they were not as enraged as I was at the insanity going on in the world about me. They should be outraged, or so I believed. How can any sane, reasonable person not be outraged at such obvious injustice? One day, while raging at a woman friend of mine for something about which she had no responsibility, she stopped me saying, "Your anger is unacceptable." No one had ever done this to me. Least of all one that I had as much respect for and still do as this woman. It caused me to re-examine myself and my approach to the outside world. I came to recognize that I was abusing this person that I cared about and respected highly, because I had some issues with someone else. This made no sense. I came to see that my anger, that I considered completely justified due to the outrages that inflamed it, was simply destroying the world around me. It was adding no benefit to my life, nor to the world. This was the first step in my dealing with my anger. The adult children of alcoholics group came after that, and then I also spent a lot of time and energy working with Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication methods. NVC, as it is called, shows you that your emotional reactions are not what someone else does to you, but are rather your own issues that are triggered by something the other person says or does. The key is they are your own issues and not the other person's responsibilities. This took a long time for me to get my head around, but now it makes a lot of sense to me. My feelings are my own, and what I do in regards to them are my own responsibility. With NVC, the idea is that feelings are valid regardless of what they are, as they are simply a natural reaction. But what you do with those feelings is a whole different thing. He teaches that each of us is responsible for our own feelings. They are the result of our own issues, not the result of what someone else says to us. How we respond is also our responsibility. It is not up to the other person to change, but rather up to us to explain our needs to the other person and then request the behavior from them that we would like. They, of course, are perfectly free to act as they will to our request. Now, this is getting a bit off course, but has some pertinence. So, the issue with Steph's yelling touched some of my issues, as he pointed out. Specifically, I felt anger at his yelling because it triggered the sense of a person lashing out irrationally, and that there is nothing I can do that will have any effect as regards this rage. I believe that anger is a manifestation of fear. This belief comes from my own experience and seems to hold true. A person who is effective need not get angry. One who has no control over situations and is fearful about them becomes angry as he fears loss and sees no way to prevent it. He feels impotent. Anger is thus a natural reaction to stimulate defense mechanisms and pump out the adrenaline. This is excellent if strong defense is required, but rarely is that the case. More often, at least in the modern world, thoughtful and rational planning and responses will bring the most results and the greatest chance for a positive resolution to the situation. Hearing Steph's yelling triggered my sense that I was powerless in an irrational world. I got angry. I wrote while still in the height of my anger, and while I do believe that much of what I said was rational and coherent, the fact that I was angry took away much of the value of my post. So what happened is that I became exactly what I was accusing Steph of being. My anger did not help me to make a rational email. I do, however, feel that the points that I was making were valid ones, and I've tried to restate them here without the anger and to explain why I find that anger is not beneficial. I appreciate the feedback, and Steph was on the mark regarding the issue being related to my childhood. Now, whether anger is beneficial to someone who does not believe the issues that I have, well, that is another question. I cannot believe that it is, nor can I believe that it is a useful tool for resolving issues productively. But I'll shut up and let others play in the sandbox. I thought it was a good letter. I think that there are a lot of really good points in this letter. I specifically agree with anger is not, that we are responsible for our own feelings, that, other people don't make us mad. When they do or say something, it triggers something in our own past. We are responsible for the reactions. We are responsible for the behavior that comes out of those initial emotional reactions. Nobody else makes us feel or do anything. I completely and totally agree with that.
As adults.
As adults,
right.
Yes.
As children, we are absolutely beholden to the stimuli that our parents provide, as this gentleman quite reasonably points out.
Yes. As adults. Now, I have a number of comments that I want to make. He says that, he specifically, I felt anger at his yelling because it triggered the sense of a person lashing out irrationally, and that there's nothing I can do that will have any effect as regards this rage. And, I think that's really pretty interesting, and I do think that has something to do with, again, not knowing very much about this gentleman other than what I've read in this post, that does have to do with his own past. What I wanted to say is when I watched Steph when I watched that post on humiliation,
The podcast.
When I listened to the podcast on humiliation, I too was startled by the passion and the yelling that I heard coming from staff, but I didn't feel in any way that the yelling was abusive. I didn't think that staff was trying to humiliate or punish anyone. I felt that he was just being very passionate in his beliefs and expressing it in a very passionate way. And I also didn't think that his yelling was the result of an irrational belief. In fact, I think what Steph was doing was talking about exactly what this guy was saying earlier in his post. I'm outraged that the world is this way. And that's what Steph was saying, that he was outraged, or that he is outraged that the world is this way, that we allow people to treat their children in this way. Was he yelling at anyone? Was he trying to humiliate anybody? Was he trying to put people in their place? That wasn't my experience, and I definitely don't think that that's what he was trying to do when he was making those comments in such a passionate and forceful way. The other thing is that this gentleman, in his email, he says, anger is a manifestation of fear. I agree with that statement. I think that, however, anger is also, as a manifestation of fear, anger is a secondary emotion. He says, one who has no control over a situation and is fearful then becomes angry as he fears loss and sees no way to prevent it. And in that regard, yes, anger is a manifestation of fear, and it is a secondary emotion.
Oh, sorry, just so I understand what that means. Does it mean it's a defensive reaction to an inability to experience fear? Like if you
Not
look
to appear vulnerable.
Sorry?
Not to appear vulnerable.
Not to appear vulnerable. So somebody who feels that they're being unmasked or something is going against their status in a particular kind of situation. Like if somebody's being hypocritical and somebody's exposing them, then they feel fear at being exposed as a hypocrite. And oftentimes that may manifest itself as rage or anger.
Yes.
So it's a that kind of, I would call that rage. I don't know what the technical term is, but it's a reaction formation to a perceived humiliation.
Yeah, a reaction formation is an excellent way to put it. I call it a secondary emotion. As a primary emotion, I believe that there are four basic emotions that we as human beings are capable of experiencing and expressing, and not just capable. I mean that these are innate emotions within us, and I think everything else can sort of be reduced down to one of these four, and they're very easy to remember. They're mad, sad, glad, and scared. And I think anger is a primary emotion. It can be primary and secondary, but I think it can be a primary emotion in the sense that it is absolutely essential for us to be able to experience and express anger and to communicate anger, because anger allows us to know that there has been an injustice. In this case, it's different than the reaction formation that we were talking about. If someone does something that violates you in some way, your initial reaction is anger. If you have been raised in a very healthy way, you don't become fearful. You feel the anger primarily, and then you may become fearful if you recognize that, if it's a bear that's coming at you, you'll be terrified. But you will also feel angry.
Right, but I think in this guy's history, again, this is very like seat of the pants psychology, because we don't know much about this gentleman, but in this guy's history, he talks about his family was relatively peaceful, it was relatively happy, but it was alcoholic, and that his parents were consistently messing with his sense of reality, opposing his development of rationality, of independence, of empiricism, of objective judgment, of sensual evidence. And that is an incredibly corrosive, passive-aggressive attack on a child's identity, which is going to make a child enraged. But then what happens is if the child expresses anger, the assault intensifies. So the child in that passive-aggressive environment will be provoked to intense anger through an assault on his rational cognitive faculties. That is passive-aggressive, not like just beating him up or something. The child then gets very angry, but when the child gets angry, the passive-aggressive attacks increase, And so the anger then becomes associated with a kind of fear, because it becomes
Yes.
a kind of end game. It's an end game or an edge game. It's very, very high stakes at that point.
Yes.
Does that sort of make sense?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think that's why it becomes. That's why a lot of people who have problems with anger do have problems with rage. They feel there's been some kind of an assault on their character, that they feel insecure, and they can't allow themselves that the fear that goes with that. They need to be able to experience that fear and process that fear to get through to the core of the issue so that they can grow. But they mask that fear, as this gentleman is saying, with anger, because that allows them not to feel the initial vulnerability.
Right. So in that formulation, when I was in the car doing the podcast on humiliation, that I was, I mean, if I understand this gentleman's, and it's certainly possible, certainly something to examine, that I was actually experiencing a kind of vulnerability or a kind of, that I was experiencing a kind of fear of whatever kind it was, that my anger was a reaction formation to a fear that I was experiencing within the car while I was doing the podcast.
That's what I think he's implying, but that's not what I believe was happening.
Okay, but how would we know?
That's a good question. How would we know?
I mean, there's guts level, whatever, but I certainly would not counteract or say, well, the gut level that you and I are experiencing about that podcast is much more relevant or real than the gut level experience that this guy's having or other people are having about that particular podcast. That wouldn't be, I mean, so how do we know what's appropriate and what's not in that kind of... I mean, the one thing that sort of springs to my mind is that I was actually experiencing no external threat.
No, and
Right, I mean, that's sort of important, right? Because why would I... And first of all, I've experienced vulnerability in podcasts before and had not only audio but visual, where I'm in tears and so on, because I'm all about safety and driving. And so as far as expressing vulnerability and so on beforehand, I have expressed that. As far as expressing assertiveness, when we were having problems with Francois on podcasts, or when people have been sort of attacking me, I have expressed assertiveness. And so, given that I have had the capacity to experience, tearful vulnerability and assertiveness and so on, that it wouldn't be that I'm incapable of experiencing, say, fear or vulnerability. So that would be, I think, less of an approach that would be logical, just based on, of course, this guy probably hasn't listened to all the podcasts because he's only mortal, right? Got to sleep.
Over 400 of them.
And so the fact that I have experienced these things before, where, of course, his parents probably were not able to experience those feelings at all. So a reaction formation is much more likely if you never see the original feeling. Like if the person can't express vulnerability, then you'll see the reaction formation.
Right.
But if they can't express vulnerability, unless there's some significant change, like they're drunk or they're under extreme duress or something, then you probably will see that real feeling and you won't see the reaction formation. And also the triggers that he talks about, like there's external triggers for your feelings, but given that I was in a car alone, it would be hard for me to understand what kind of external triggers were occurring. Now, of course, I was receiving an enormous amount of internal stimuli in the form of, a fairly ferocious kind of passion or anger about a particular topic or issue. That is an internally generated state and doesn't seem to fit into something that's being triggered from outside in this description.
Right, you were experiencing anger about an injustice that is occurring in the world, but you weren't, at least in my opinion, I don't think that you were being abusive. And let's define the word abusive. It means that you are purposely hurting somebody. You're abusing them. You are attacking them. And
Well, and sorry to just interrupt for a sec, because this is where the fog of these kinds of family histories always gets really tricky, at least for me, because purposefully trying to hurt someone is, you take out the belt and you whack them or something like that. But in this kind of instance, and this guy's mom, although my mom wasn't much of a drinker, she had particular emotional characteristics that I can certainly identify with, like a complete inability to admit that she's wrong. And sometimes she would even rope in her psychologist wife to prove that I wasn't wrong. Oh, wait, sorry, that's me. she had a complete inability to admit a fault or error, to change her position, no matter what the evidence was, right? I mean, and so in this kind of situation where, as he says in this silly example, the door is open, the rain is coming in, and she says the door is closed, is that a purposeful desire to try and hurt someone in the same way as, pulling out a belt? And, like, to me, that would be more of an unconscious defensive mechanism. Absolutely more destructive, in my view, than pulling out a belt and hitting a kid with it, which is tangible and leaves marks and gives you something to remember that really is bad. I mean, this is even worse, but it's hard to remember. So I think it's almost the subtlety of this kind of what he experienced from his parents, this inconstancy, this lack of reliability, this constant undermining of his capacity to think and so on. To me, that's extraordinarily abusive, but it has less sort of goal-directed purposefulness than, pulling out the belt and cracking the child. And maybe that's a false distinction, but...
No, I think you're right. It's a good point that you make, and maybe I did jump the gun when I said that there was purpose in the abuse, or conscious purpose in the abuse. But I'm completely off the point now, so...
The question you had was that you wanted to. He said that the podcast may have been abusive, and the first thing we need to do is to define abuse.
Right.
And you said it was sort of the purposeful desire to harm someone else, and I don't know the degree to which like when you're defending yourself, as this guy's mom seems to be doing, right? When she can't admit that she's wrong, and she also has an unconscious desire to destroy the rationality of her son in this case. That is a
But the point, the difference here is that to destroy the rationality, and the difference is here that you're talking about rational ideas and facts. There's nothing. You're not trying to obscure something. You're actually trying to uncover something. You're like this gentleman who said in the beginning. He said he couldn't believe that the amount of injustice that was out there, and nobody else could see the injustice. My guess, though, however, is that he would get angry because of all this injustice, and then he would walk around through life getting angry at people or acting out that anger in some ways, like he said, in his other relationships that had nothing to do with those relationships, but with this deep-seated anger that he had. So you're not an angry person. You don't go around abusing people. I live with you. And I certainly have never, ever, ever, ever seen that. The difference is that you were identifying the injustice, and you were being clear about what you felt about that injustice. You were angry at that injustice. That's what I think was happening.
Right. Whereas this gentleman, and I think he says at the beginning of this post, does he say that his home was relatively peaceful and happy?
Yeah. Relatively peaceful and happy.
Yeah, no, so I would say that even though he hasn't seen his mom in 12 years, right, I think it was Dr. Phil who said on that lecture we were listening to that you have to kind of earn your way out of relationships. You kind of have to, and this is sort of what I'm talking about with people. I developed it before I heard this, but it's a good way of putting it, that you don't, if you're going to break up with someone, you've kind of got to try everything, and when everything that you've conceivably can think of trying has failed, then you can be done with that relationship and you don't have to look back. And I think that although this guy hasn't seen his mom in 12 years or talked to her, I don't know what happened with the father or any siblings, but given that he introduces it by saying, I do not come from an abusive background, it was relatively peaceful and relatively happy, I think what is possible is that at a conscious level, and whether it's a defense or not, I don't know, but at a conscious level, he's saying, I wasn't beaten, I had a roof over my head, I had 3 meals a day, I was tucked in at night, every now and then I'd get a drunken, slurred bedtime story that was relatively comforting, and we know this particular scenario, right, because you and I come from these sort of opposite poles of family histories, where mine was more openly violent, but yours was more stifling, conformist kind of approval, disapproval, control.
Absolutely.
Right, so and this guy is sitting here, I think at a conscious level, saying it wasn't that abusive.
I get that completely, 100% through and through. In my core, I get that.
Right, and you go.
Yeah, there was maybe no physical violence. Perhaps your parents didn't swear or use harsh harsh language or expletives when they communicated, but certainly there was a lot of. My guess is that there were a lot of expectations. You had to be a certain way, or there was maybe a lot of rigidity, and they were always right, and yet they always told you that it was about you and you.
And a lot of and what was different from you, he had a lot of raising of expectations followed by betrayal, followed by a betrayal of those expectations.
Right.
Which meant that he was sort of wooed into having hope from his parents, and then continually that was undermined and destroyed. That's a kind of repetition compulsion that really undermines and harms somebody's ability to trust themselves and to trust others. It's corrosive in that kind of way. And I know that wasn't what you experienced particularly that way.
No, it wasn't necessarily what I experienced. But I've seen enough people who have come from alcoholic homes, and there's definitely there's just a lot of fear in those homes, and there is a lot of anger, even though it may not be expressed openly, outwardly, aggressively. And I think he obviously is aware of a lot of this. He's gone to the 12-step program, the Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is highly recommended, and a number of my clients have attended these as well and speak highly of them. Great learning, great places to go for learning. But there's a lot of stuff that probably happened in the home. I don't know if he's had any individual counseling to help him work through some of these issues as well.
I'm sure that would have been mentioned.
He talks about going to...
No, he learned about those
Marshall
books.
Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. I don't know if that was through a therapist or just by reading a book. I don't know enough about that.
I think it's a book. That was sort of my sense, although certainly he's welcome to clarify that further. Sorry, did you have more to say on that?
No, I don't think that it's fair that I sit here and try and psychoanalyze this poor person without the benefit of having had a discussion with him. But I just want to speak specifically.
Should I do it then?
I just want to speak specifically to the points that are in the.
Well, I don't. I mean,
the letter.
Give me just 2 seconds if you don't mind, because I don't know that the two can be entirely separated. But if it's possible that he looks at certain kinds of abuse that you see in homes, beatings and screamings and, the chaos and a constant parade of lovers and, drugs or whatever it is, right? That level of chaos, if you look at that and you say, well, I didn't have that. I didn't have it nearly that bad. But in my sort of experience, and maybe that's the case with you and with your patients as well, it's the subtle forms of manipulation, control, abuse, and especially around the destruction of rationality. I'm sorry?
Coercion.
Yeah, those are the aspects that are almost more dangerous, really, than the outward brutality. Because the outward brutality, you're kind of marked. You know it. You can see it. It's clear. It's historical. It's totally non-normalized. It's not corrosive. It's not like a fog. It's not subtle. It's a punch to the face, right? But it's the difference between a woman who's abused, like somebody punches her, and that gaslighting thing where somebody's just trying to make her crazy all the time. The second is a lot more insidious, and it's a lot harder to feel sympathy for yourself, because you generally tend to gravitate towards other people's experience, especially 12-step programs. You got people coming in there saying, oh yeah, my dad he drove the car through the front of the house and he set fire to my bedroom, and you're thinking like, holy crap, all my mom did was tell me that up was down was black was white. So I think that if he's going to have a certain amount of defense mechanisms or normalizing relative to other people's even more horrendous histories, then his anger, which would be extraordinary and deep and considerable at this kind of destruction of his, or attempted destruction of his cognitive capacities through contradiction, through repetition, through defensiveness on the part of the parents. If he normalizes his experience relative to other people's or whatever, then what happens to all of that anger? Well, I would say that it would get diffused to abstract topics of injustice in the world, right? Given whoever he is, maybe his intellectual capacity is obviously very intelligent, very verbal, and so on, and very sensitive, and very, kudos to him for the emotional work that he's done. But if he doesn't get that the destruction of his mind is even worse than an assault on his body would be, Right, an assault on his body, clear marks. You can go to the authorities. You can say, look, my arm got broken. You'll get taken away. You'll get sympathy. You'll get understanding. And you'll have a memory which is totally clear, where you say, hey, my dad broke my arm. Of course I had a terrible childhood. Of course I've got issues. Here's where they are, and so on. But this kind of stuff where the mind gets attacked and undermined in passive-aggressive kinds of ways, I don't know that he's going to have that kind of clarity, but he's going to have an extraordinary amount of rage, as if his arm kept getting broken, and nobody saw it, right? Because he sounds like a friend of ours who we know who had alcoholic parents. He's like, oh yeah, I got a new bike every Christmas. I had a beautiful house. Everybody thought it was great. My mom was pretty, and my dad was rich, and nobody saw, nobody could see what was going on in the household in any really compelling and powerful way. And so this guy is going to feel completely invisible in a social situation because his parents aren't going to be identified as real, brutal, violent, drunken, swearing, biker-type people. So what happens to all of that anger at the intense and devoted crippling of his mind? I'd say it's going to shoot out into abstract topics, and he's going to get really enraged about those because at the very beginning of this post he says, my house was happy.
Does he say my house was happy, or does he say my house was peaceful?
I do remember the word happy, but just if you can double-check.
I am double-checking. I did not suffer much abuse as a child. This comment, okay. I grew up in an alcoholic home, but one which was calm and happy. You're absolutely right.
Calm
For
and
the most
happy.
part, not one filled with turmoil and yelling, etc.
Right. So he says, I didn't experience much abuse. My house was calm and happy because his arms weren't broken, right? Because his legs weren't broken, because he wasn't thrown downstairs or beaten black or blue or had chairs broken over his head or anything. But it's almost, other than permanent physical injury, it's almost always completely worse to have that insistent attack upon your cognitive capacities.
Well, he says very clearly, as a child, this can really destroy one's ability to have faith in one's own sensory perception and ability to reason.
Right, but you see that dichotomy of the way he introduces the topic of my house was calm and happy, and then this can have this negative effect. See,
Sure.
These are two dissociated states. Again, totally psychologizing from a distance, right, with all the risk and inaccuracies that entails. We have two states here where he's not connected to his history. One is calm and happy. The second is this can have pretty negative effects, like it's a third party, like a documentary, like he's describing someone who has this. Not like this crippled my capacity to trust and think for myself without any huge degree of terror and fear, and like this is what actually happened. Just that. Again, I'm really sort of sifting for gold here because there's not a lot of information. But
no, good point. It's a good point. Again, I don't want to get into psychoanalyzing someone through a letter. But I do hear what you're saying, and it is a good point. I think he takes some responsibility for that, but it's possible that he needs to do more work on that particular issue. I don't know, never having spoken to him, never having met him.
But, all we have is this communication, right? So certainly if a patient were to sit down with you and say, my house was calm and happy, and then you find that it's, alcoholic, that there's a constant assault on the child's capacity to reason, you wouldn't say, hey, we'll put that on the back burner till later, let's deal with the real issues. I think you'd say that split in your communication to yourself and to others about your history versus what actually happened is an essential thing that you need to close that gap. Right?
Completely and totally, and that's what we would focus on in therapy.
That would be your first thing to focus on.
That would be, it would it would be one of the many.
Assuming he's not on a ledge, like as we speak, right? That would be,
it would be something important to focus on in therapy.
Which we wouldn't want because he's a listener. And we love the listeners.
We love the listeners. But I do think that your post, your podcast, your podcast was you expressing anger to an injustice, and I think it was a healthy anger to that injustice, and you weren't being abusive. I don't think you were being abusive. In fact, I'm completely 100% positive you were not being abusive. You were just expressing anger at an injustice that is occurring in this world, and nobody else seems to be angry about it. Nobody else seems to, or very few people, I don't want to be so absolute.
Right. Now, and I think that when I'm talking about an injustice in the world, this guy, I think, has gone through that route of talking about injustices in the world in the way that he says this can have a bad effect on a child, that the injustice is out there rather than within his own home as part of his whole skin and skeleton growing up as a child within this incredibly destructive family unit. And then his friend, this woman, he's raging about something or other that she doesn't have any control over and is not responsible for, and she says, your anger is unacceptable. And again, I mean, I'm extrapolating and so on, but to me, there's a very great difference between saying to someone, your anger is unacceptable, and saying, anger is unacceptable. And I think that to conflate the two may be problematic, right? And if this guy has a certain untapped vein of anger towards his own parents based on, the comments at the beginning of the post, then he actually uses, he goes the two extremes, which we see often in people who've gone through these kinds of difficult pasts. We see rage or compliance, right? We see too much rage or we see too little rage. Or, sorry, that's too little rage is that's not the right. We see rage or we see passivity, right? And the thing, I don't know much about the 12-step programs, but I do know that there is a religious aspect to it that is going to have something to do with forgiveness, is going to have something to do with anger is bad, right? And of course, a lot of people who grow up in these kinds of households do have that association, and who can blame them where they say anger is bad? Because they see rage, right? They see rage, and they think that that is anger. And so anger is destructive, and you and I have had this conversation before about anger. Anger is destructive, right? Because the impulse behind rage is to humiliate and to destroy and undermine others. Sorry.
Yeah. If you say anger is destructive, I don't think that's the case.
Sorry, I don't think it is. They get that rage is destructive. They think anger and rage are the two things.
Yeah, exactly. Because anger is healthy. Anger is absolutely a healthy emotion. It is one of the four, as I mentioned, and this is the point that I just wanted to bring up once again. It is a primary human emotion, and it's important that we are able to feel it, express it, and communicate it. It is an indication that there has been a violation. And we need to be able to experience, express, and communicate that anger so that we don't continue to be violated.
Right, and given how much violation is actually occurring in the world these days, I think it's fair for us to say that there's stuff to be angry about in the world, and it doesn't mean that we live our lives consumed with chronic bitterness and rage.
Bingo. You're not consumed with chronic bitterness and rage. You don't go, which is what I said before, you don't go around raging at people. You don't yell at people. You don't abuse people. You don't try to manipulate people. You don't call people names. You don't shove people. You don't slam doors. You do not have that level of anger or rage. That's just not part of your character. Which is why when you were angry in this post, it was definitely startling, but it was not abusive.
Right, and that's great, and I certainly appreciate that. But to say it is something that and that's great. It's certainly great for other people who don't know me to get that perspective, and I certainly will let you out of the box once we're finished the podcast. The question is, what is the difference? And one possibility might be that if this gentleman has a rage that the world does not recognize, and a legitimate anger at an injustice that the world does not recognize, we are very dependent upon the judgments of other people. I certainly always have been. There's this Randian idea of the second-hander who stands above the primary soul who is not a second-hander. That's never been my experience. I'm heavily dependent upon the opinions of others, and I always have been, and I always will be, right? That's why it's so important that I just have quality people in my life. Because if I have... and do you remember when I first started these podcasts and I'd get these, rain of negative mail, and I was like, I feel like I've been pulled under. It was a very difficult situation to go through emotionally, to get, and it wasn't that I got a tougher skin. I'll always be ridiculously sensitive to that kind of stuff, but it's just a matter of gaining perspective and getting better and more logical arguments. But it's very difficult to go through, to be in a social environment and have everybody to disagree with you or whatever. It's very hard, at least for me and for most people that I've ever met, if not everyone, to sort of maintain an independent thought for yourself. And so if this guy has an abuse in his home that is not socially recognized as gruesome and evil, which I would certainly say a constant assault upon a child's capacity to reason and trust his own senses even, not even just his mind, but his senses, that's a gruesome kind of child abuse, possibly the worst, other than, say, sexual abuse. But if he is in a situation where nobody around him gets how bad he had it, then he's not going to be able to feel it. I mean, if he had a great therapist, if he had you, then he might be able to get to that point where he totally gets how much destruction was inflicted upon him or attempted to be inflicted upon him as a child. Then he would get angry at his parents to the point where he wouldn't introduce his childhood history by saying it was calm and happy. Right? He would actually be able to get really angry at his parents. Then his rage would not be, his legitimate anger wouldn't be diluted into a general rage. Right? Like the guy I'm not going to put any names out there, but the gentleman that we saw on my birthday, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he has reason to be angry about the way he was raised, but he won't feel that.
No, he won't.
And so what he does is he dilutes it into a general cynicism about human nature.
Yes.
Because it's a lot easier, as we were talking about in the show today, this afternoon, it's a whole lot easier to get angry about the government and I don't know what this gentleman was getting angry about, but it obviously wasn't his parents, right? Because if it was his parents, then his rage would not be considered inappropriate. But it's a lot easier to get angry about abstracts and to be cynical about human nature and call everyone sheeple and stupid, and I'm not saying that's what this guy is doing, rather than to actually sort of get down and dirty with your own feelings and really get them all sorted out. But I think that he's been in a situation where there has been no, what do we call it, echoing or reflection or mirroring. Thank you. There's been no mirroring to help him to really get how bad he had it as a child. And so I think that this podcast was an important one for him because he saw someone getting angry at abstracts, but not as a result of thwarted anger about a personal injustice. Right? So I think that I've reached a level of maturity and of dealing with my own past where I can get angry at the universal abuse of children, say, and I don't feel that is a twisted substitute for my own anger at my own upbringing or something like that. Does that?
Yeah, and I would have to agree. I have to agree wholeheartedly.
So what I'm trying to say is that there's an interesting kind of inverse that's going on here. If this gentleman is unable to see the horror of his own history, for which it's absolutely heartbreaking to think about, and that's not going to do much good at this point, but if he can't see the heartbreak of his own childhood, then he's going to rage against abstractions or other things or the world's injustice or whatever, and that is going to be an inappropriate level of anger because it is a redirect from the just anger, which he feels towards his parents but was never mirrored on, and so society doesn't recognize it and so on, right?
There's something else here, though. He says, I've tried to restate my points here without the anger and to explain why I find that anger is not beneficial. And I think right there we have a problem. Anger is beneficial. I understand, he says a little earlier, he said that in the modern world, thoughtful and rational planning and responses will bring about the most results and the greatest chance for a positive resolution to the situation. And I think that's absolutely true. But we need to get angry first.
Right,
we need to be angry and to express anger and say that this is not right.
Yes, and I think that when he was with his friend talking about, this female friend, talking about whatever it was that he was enraged about, and she said, your anger is unacceptable, it's possible that a more elegant way of asking that or opposing his abstract anger would be to say, come on, what are you really angry at? What are you really angry about? I get that there's injustice in the world. I get that bad things happen overseas and that the government is this and that. But what are you really angry at? Because I feel that this is not an authentic, gut-level kind of anger that makes me understand at a real moral level what's going on. Like, it's too much. It's all over the place.
That's asking a lot for his
No,
friend,
absolutely.
right?
That would be a ridiculously elegant thing to ask for, but I think it might be a more accurate thing to ask for, is to say to people who are angry, like we could certainly say this to the guy that we saw last weekend, right? And, when he's talking about, the people are this and the people are that and so on, to just say, come on,
what are you really angry about?
What are you really angry about here?
Yeah.
What's really
the real
going on
issue
for you?
here?
Yes, for sure there's injustice in the world, but I think you kind of have to earn your way to getting angry about the injustice of the world, and you do that by making sure that it's not a redirect from your own history. Like, it's not a reaction formation so you get angry at the world, because your anger's going to come out somewhere. And so...
I don't know. I agree with what you're saying. I don't know about this gentleman. Again, I've never met him. This is the only thing I know about him. But what I get from this last second to last paragraph or so is that, that he doesn't think that anger is useful. Anger is not beneficial, and I think therein lies the problem. Anger is beneficial.
But in his definition, anger is not beneficial. Like, in the definition of anger that he's working in,
Sure.
which is
That's what I'm
rage
saying,
against
that's where the problem
abstractions
is.
towards people that didn't
That's
cause
what
them.
I'm saying. That's where the problem is.
Right. Of course, that is not productive, for sure. For sure.
Right. And so I think when you got angry and you expressed anger and you said, like, with an extreme ferocity, that was very startling for sure. But I don't believe that it was abusive, because you weren't directing it at anyone. You weren't.
Oh, I was directing it at the unjust, but I certainly didn't have any
unjust.
unjust people in the car that I was yelling at. I wish I had, but...
No, you were directing it at the unjust, but you weren't causing anybody harm.
Well, no, and neither was I attempting to obscure or undermine anybody's capacity to reason, right? I think that after 420 podcasts or whatever, people understand that, whether they agree or not, that I have good reasons behind what it is that I'm saying. I don't mean perfect, I don't mean all absolutely true, but that I'm not just sort of like ranting guy, but I do actually have a pretty strong logical framework behind what it is that I'm working with as a philosopher. And so if I get angry, it's possible, and this is what we're trying to work through, that it is that my feelings and my values are in sync. Right, so when I see an injustice, it makes me angry. When I think about the universal injustice of the humiliation and abuse of children that results in genocides and wars and states and gulags and rapes and murders and suicides, that the amount of suffering and misery in the world that's caused by that is so extreme that it almost feels like you couldn't get angry enough, in a sense, like you wouldn't have a lifetime in which to do it. You could yell yourself hoarse and you still wouldn't be anywhere close to it. But if this gentleman has a tendency to abstract his anger towards philosophical, political, economic topics, maybe even psychological topics, and is missing the core, and I've sort of done the core, so now I can get legitimately angry at other things without feeling like it's a misdirect, then we kind of have a weird mirroring going on, which is why maybe the conversation got so intense so quickly, that I'm doing something that's very close to what he used to do, but is the exact opposite. Because I'm talking about abstracts and getting angry, which is what he used to do, but it's quite the opposite, because I've kind of earned my way there through all the therapy and through all of the sort of self-knowledge that I've been working on.
I see. I would think that that's very sophisticated, and I'm not sure. Again, I don't know enough about him to say whether or not that's true or not. It's certainly a possibility.
Hey, I'll take it. I'll take that. And there's just one last... Sorry, did you have something else you wanted to add?
No, you...
There's just one last thing that I'd like to mention about this very intelligent and very well-written post, which is... okay, and this you may believe is a valid thing to say or to approach, and you may not, who knows. But... So what I came to understand, as he says, is that because of alcohol I could not count on consistency from my parents. They would say one thing and then forget that they'd said it, or they would remember things differently and be adamant in this false recollection. My mother specifically had a way about her that is the core issue for this current discussion. Whether alcohol is at the heart of this or not, I cannot say. But the issue is that she is not open to examining her ideas. When I approach her with an idea that goes against her belief, she will strongly point out that I am wrong and that this is the end of the discussion. I wouldn't say that it is yelling, but it is a firm and elevated tone of voice, and it carries a conviction that the issue is closed. I could be standing at the door with the blah, 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 blah. Right? I learned from this that there is no point in even bothering to discuss anything with her. It is a waste of time, and so on. Do you know what the subtlety is that I'm getting here? I put some mild emphasis on the words that I think are particularly relevant.
No, I don't know, because you're...
It's all in the present tense.
Oh, it's all in the present tense.
It's all in the present tense.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. That's a very astute observation.
Well, thank you. Well, and the reason that I got that was that when he was talking about his mom, I'm like, wow, that sucks. Oh, my God, that's terrible. Oh, how evil. And then he said, well, I haven't talked to her for 12 years. But have a look at that paragraph again. It's all in the present tense.
I could not count on any consistency. That's in the past. My mother specifically had a way about her.
Yeah, the had, I agree. I'm totally with you on the had, but look at everything after that.
Not that she is not open to examining her ideas. When I approach her, yes, currently, that I am wrong, she will.
And actually, it's not only present, but it's also future tense. She will. Mm-hmm. And so this would be an indication to me, again, I mean, you can take this with a grain of salt or not, this would be an indication to me that this guy, this gentleman who, don't get me wrong, I have an enormous amount of respect for. This is a very erudite, self-aware, and so on post, so this is not meant in any negative way. But it's possible that he stopped seeing his mom, he stopped getting angry, he kind of put everything into a box, right, which doesn't work. And the reason that we know that it doesn't work is because he now can't handle other people being angry. Right, this is he's kind of just said, okay, well, I'm just not going to use my right arm anymore because it keeps knocking things over. And so rather than go through rehab and learn, I'm not going to use my right arm anymore.
Just like saying anger is not beneficial.
Well, it's the same thing, right? My left arm is love, right arm is anger. Well, I'm just going to use my left. I'm not going to use my right arm, right? But then, of course, and you feel that that's the right thing to do. And then when you see somebody using their right arm, it makes you anxious, right? Because your right arm wants to be used, right? Anger wants to be used. There's a lot to be angry about in the world. We just have to make sure that it's just.
Anger is important.
Right, and anger cures.
Anger heals.
Anger cures, anger heals. Rage destroys.
Right.
But anger cures and anger heals.
Right.
But you have to earn your way to healthy anger. I think that I have. I'm certainly not saying that everything that I do is, good heavens. But I think that I've earned my way to healthy anger, which is not to say that it's not always worth re-examining the question as we're sort of doing now. But I sort of do get a sense that this guy stopped seeing his mom, dealt with some issues, more power to him, went to AA, found out through AA that forgiveness is important and anger is bad.
Not AA, slightly different organization.
Children of AA, Children of Alcoholics.
Adult Children of Alcoholics, ACOA.
ACOA. Sorry, I thought that was a Native American tribe, but actually probably is. But so he learned forgiveness is important and anger is bad, right? Which moved him from a guy who would get angry and this woman who's scared by his anger is inappropriate, from that to compliance, from rage to submission, from rage to compliance, and that to me is not the same as dealing with injustice.
Right, and I also don't know enough about the 12-step programs. I know that for a lot of people they're very good. I know for a lot of people that they aren't very useful at all. So I don't know what position the Adult Children of Alcoholics groups or the AA groups or the NA groups or whatever. I don't know what position they take on anger, whether they say that anger is something that is unhealthy, whether they say that anger is something that is destructive. I don't know. So I don't know where he's coming from in that regard.
It's again, I don't know either, but based on his stuff that he talks about later, where he says that this guy's approach to anger, I can't remember the guy's name, Rosenberg, that other people don't create your feelings. Well, of course not. When you're an adult, that it's not that you feel. Feelings are all healthy and great. Of course, we all agree with that. It's what you do with them that's important. No problem with that. That's entirely fair as well.
I totally agree with all of that.
So, but I'm still not convinced just at my gut level, which proves nothing, of course, right? But I'm still, not convinced that this guy has effectively understood the complete degree of moral horror and existential horror, right? And that's, I won't spend a lot of time on that, because that's really the great challenge that these kinds of subtle abuse families create.
Well, that's what we do in therapy, right? That's what
Existential horror, there's a lot of that in therapy. People come back for that? That's amazing to me. But anyway, go on, sorry.
But that's what we do in therapy. We have, my goal as a therapist is to have people see reality clearly, to understand the injustices, to understand the abuses that they were subjected to. People who weren't abused don't come to therapy. And so...
Who's these people who aren't abused that I keep hearing about? The theoretical tiny minority, right? Of one form or another.
And that's the point of therapy. To break free of all the illusions, to be real, to be able to feel all your feelings fully, completely, totally, passionately, and to let your feelings guide you.
Right, so that you don't constantly have to monitor and worry about your feelings. Like, so you get angry and you're like, oh God, should I be angry? Should I not be angry? Should I say this? Should I say that? But you can simply just trust your feelings, that they're not going to make you run off cliffs or, shoot dogs or something like that. But that your feelings are integrated with your values, so that you're not going to act in ways that are self-destructive.
The one thing I want to say is that takes a long, 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 long time. A long, 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 long time to achieve, to get to the point where you can actually trust your feelings, to be able to say...
Oh, for me it was 18 to 24 hours, easy. So hard, and I'm just so glad that I got that done on our honeymoon. Sorry, go on.
It takes a really long time to be able to get to the point where you actually can trust your feelings, to know that when you feel anger, that you don't have to look for an excuse or a reason. I feel or to reason it away. I feel angry in this moment. There must be some injustice. Let me find out what the injustice is.
Right. I certainly know that it was hard for me in our relationship to trust when I felt an injustice had occurred, to not assume that I was being oversensitive based on my past or whatever, but simply to trust that was something that was occurring that was worth exploring, that shouldn't be, not that you ever did, but shouldn't be sort of diminished by myself, and say, oh, okay, well, I shouldn't get upset about this, I shouldn't cause a fuss, I shouldn't whatever, right? And other people have it the opposite way, where they just blow up all the time, and they have to learn to, when there's sort of two switches. There's volume 11 and then turned off completely, right? They don't have that gradation in the middle because of the abuse, right? So I'm guessing that to some degree this may be where this guy's coming from. Again, we're just sort of beating the bushes a little bit here, but that certainly could be the case based on some stuff that's in the post. And I certainly look forward to his feedback and see how the conversation moves forward.
Like you, I think it was a fantastic letter. I think this gentleman looks like he's done some really good work on himself, and my goal here wasn't to pick him apart in any way, but to understand the look of shock on Steph's face as I say that.
But honey, he was abusing me. Surely that much is clear. Ooh, we're back in the grocery store again.
No, but just to understand your reactions or what was happening for you, and how it affected some people on the board, but more to talk about anger and its purpose and its value in terms of how we live our life.
Well, thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to my lovely guest host, who hopefully acted as a fairly decent character witness to my levels of rage, which I'm obviously working on. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you soon.